In 1588, the most powerful fleet ever assembled, 130 ships, 30,000 men, was beaten not by a superior navy, but partly by its own design. The Spanish Armada was built around the Galleon, a ship meant to carry treasure, soldiers, and cannon all at once. The English answered with something leaner, meaner, and purpose-built to kill. Two philosophies of what a warship should be collided in the English Channel, and the world was never the same. Tonight, we're going inside both ships, deck by deck, gun by gun, to find out which floating world was truly the deadlier machine. One of the answers will surprise you. The ship that won that famous battle had a fatal flaw that nearly destroyed its own empire.
The Galleon's most dangerous enemy wasn't English cannon. It was a design decision made in a Seville shipyard decades before the first shot was fired. And the man-of-war's celebrated broadside, the real story of how effective it actually was, will reframe everything you think you know about the age of sail. These two ships were not rivals who grew up together. They were answers to completely different questions. The Galleon came first. Born in Iberian yards around the 1520s and 1530s, carved out of the older, round-bellied carrack that had served Mediterranean trade routes well enough, but wallowed dangerously in Atlantic swells. Spain and Portugal needed something leaner, lower at the bow, capable of holding a fighting force and a fortune in the same hold. Silver from the mines at Potosí, soldiers from Castile, provisions for 6 months at sea, all of it packed into one hull, crossing roughly 4,000 miles of open ocean. The word galleon itself likely traces back to the Spanish Galleon, a large galley-derived vessel. A working compromise from day one. The man-of-war arrived a generation later, out of English and Dutch yards in the late 16th century, and it asked none of those same questions. It carried no silver. It had no interest in arriving anywhere in particular, only in sinking what stood between it and the enemy. Every design decision, from the reinforced lower deck to the staggered gun ports, served one purpose: delivering the heaviest possible broadside and surviving long enough to do it twice. Same ocean, opposite reasons for being on it. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We go this deep on every ship. Picture the two hulls side by side on a slipway. The Galleon towers, its forecastle and sterncastle stacked 3, sometimes 4 decks high above the waterline, timber walls catching the wind like a barn broadside on to a storm. Beautiful, imposing, and
aerodynamically catastrophic. In a strong crosswind, those upper works acted as an unintended second sail, shoving the hull sideways faster than the rudder could correct. Sailors called that drift leeway, and a galleon bled it badly.
The man-of-war was cut down. Its upper decks were stripped back, its profile kept deliberately low, so the sea grabbed the keel, instead of the wind grabbing the superstructure. That difference shows up cleanly in the numbers. A typical galleon ran a beam-to-length ratio of roughly 1:3, wide and comparatively short. A late-period man-of-war pushed toward 1:3.5. Half a unit of proportion, written in oak and pitch. But it meant the warship could tack across the wind where the galleon was forced to wear, swinging its entire stern through the wind, burning sea room it could not afford in a narrow channel or a fleet engagement. One consequence no captain wanted to admit: caught in a gale on a lee shore, the galleon's own grandeur could drive it onto the rocks. That difference in hull profile didn't just affect how each ship sailed, it determined where the guns could go, and what those guns
were actually for. On a galleon, cannon appeared almost everywhere. A few heavy pieces on the lower deck, lighter swivel guns along the rails, soldiers' arquebuses stacked near the forecastle. The guns shared space with trade goods, rigging stores, and the logic of a ship that might need to fight but was not built to. Size. Heavy weather meant closing the lower gun ports entirely. Water came in otherwise, which could silence the most powerful weapons at exactly the wrong moment.
The shift was not just architectural, it was a declaration of purpose. A man of war carried nothing it did not need for battle, and every timber, spar, and beam was calculated toward that end. Where a galleon's captain weighed fighting against trading, a man of war's captain had no such choice to make. The English race-built galleons of the 1580s, Sir John Hawkins's leaner, lower-profile designs, pointed toward this logic. But the true man of war pushed it further, stacking 2 or 3 full tiers and making the broadside the vessel's only honest answer to any question asked of it. Every timber served the cannon. Nothing else got a vote. That overloading wasn't accidental, it was policy. The Spanish crown had spent decades demanding that its ships do everything at once, and the shipwrights of Seville had learned to say yes. What we're really tracing, deck by deck, is the moment that compromise became catastrophic. That overloaded question had a number attached to it, and the number is brutal. A large Spanish galleon of the Armada period carried around 50 guns, but count them carefully. Swivel pieces, anti-personnel railguns, small breech loaders meant to sweep a deck of soldiers, not to punch through oak planking at 200 yards. The genuine ship killers were a minority aboard. The English Ark Royal, flagship of 1588, carried fewer total guns, but concentrated on the culverin, a long, slender iron piece throwing a roughly 17-pound ball with enough range to stand off and work at distances a galleon's mixed battery couldn't effectively answer. Howard's captains used that reach deliberately, staying outside the Spanish boarding envelope and hammering from a distance the Armada's short-range pieces couldn't match. Move forward 60 years.
Ours and the gap becomes a chasm. A first-rate English man-of-war of the mid-17th century mounted 100 guns across 3 continuous decks, throwing a broadside weight of iron exceeding 1,000 pounds in a single salvo.
The Galleon never approached that figure. Its hull simply couldn't stack 3 loaded gun decks without the structure failing under its own weight, and the timber that might have reinforced it was already spoken for, holding trade goods and empire together. 1,000 pounds of iron, once a minute. The Galleon brought arquebuses to that conversation. Galleon or man of war? Which would you rather serve on? Drop your pick below. That firepower gap didn't fall from the sky. It was built into the people standing on the deck. A 500-ton galleon typically carried somewhere between 200 and 300 men, and a substantial share of them were soldiers. Armored, armed, trained to board and to hold a deck against a rush of enemy bodies. Useful? Absolutely. But in a gunnery exchange, a pikeman standing at the rail is essentially a passenger. He cannot crew a culverin. He cannot trim a sail in a squall to hold the weather gauge. A comparable man of war carried a tighter, harder complement. Trained topmen who could work the rigging under fire, and gunners who drilled on their pieces repeatedly, loading and running out by muscle memory rather than improvisation. The ship's whole fighting philosophy demanded that kind of specialization. Feeding and watering either crew across a 6-month Atlantic crossing was its own catastrophe. Accounts from Spanish colonial voyages describe rations reduced to weevil-riddled biscuit and brackish water.
Well before landfall. But the galleon's soldier-heavy manifest meant that when the broadsides started, the men most needed were the fewest trained to answer them. Size. Courage doesn't reload a cannon.
That crew mismatch points directly to something most accounts get backwards. The galleon's soldiers weren't a design flaw. They were the entire point. Strip away the hindsight, and the ship makes perfect sense. Close the distance, throw grappling hooks, let the musketeers in those towering fore and stern castles sweep the enemy deck from above, then pour 300 armed men over the rail into a ship that simply cannot absorb that kind of human pressure. It was a floating assault platform, and for the better part of a century, it worked. Bahai castles everyone mocks as top-heavy dead weight. Fighting galleries. Elevated firing positions giving musketeers a downward angle into an enemy's rigging and open deck, the 16th century equivalent of holding the high ground. In 1588, the English commanders understood this perfectly, which is why they refused to come
within grappling range at all. They stayed outside the boarding envelope and turned the engagement into the one kind of battle the Galleon was never designed to win, a sustained gunnery duel at distance.
The Galleon didn't lose because it was obsolete. It lost because its opponent declined the invitation. One pikeman standing at the rail, watching the English ships hold their distance, never close enough to touch. That inability to close the distance wasn't just a tactical embarrassment. It was baked into the physics of the hull. Both ships, in a fair wind and calm water, could push toward 8 knots. On paper, roughly equal. But the Atlantic almost never offered fair wind and calm water, and that is where the shapes diverged completely. The man-of-war's lower freeboard and flatter run aft let it point closer to the wind, somewhere around 60 degrees off the breeze on a good day. Tacking was predictable, repeatable, something a well-drilled crew could execute in a squall without losing steerage. That maneuverability was the engagement range selector. Close when you chose, open distance when you chose. The Galleon, deep laden with silver or troops, sat lower in the water, and the towering castles caught the wind like a barn door. Spanish pilots during the Armada campaign recorded exactly this frustration. Their ships could not claw upwind to bring the English within boarding distance. The English simply bore away, opened the gap, and kept firing. The Galleon soldiers stood at the rail with nowhere to go. 8 knots meant nothing when the enemy owned the upwind lane. And that fatal flaw had nothing to do with Spanish cannon. It lived in the hold, in the barrels, the bee.
Isquit, the beer. What truly separated these two vessels wasn't firepower or hull design, but logistics. Not what they fired, but what they carried, and how far they could carry it.
The deadliest dimension of this comparison is still ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the verdict. What do you think sank more Armada ships? English guns or the Atlantic storm? Guess before the reveal. What they carried tells you everything about what they were built to be. A galleon's hold ran deep, typically 300 to 500 tons of usable cargo space, packed with silver bars from Potosí, bales of cochineal dye, cured hides, and pepper sacks. That cargo didn't just pay for the voyage, it paid for the army in Flanders, the court of Madrid, the next fleet. The Manila Galleon route, Acapulco to Manila, running annually from 1565 all the way to 1815, was the longest continuous trade route in human history, and it ran entirely on galleons. 250 years of silver moving in one direction, silk and porcelain moving in the other, across the widest ocean on Earth. The man-of-war carried almost nothing. Its hold was ammunition, salt beef, water casks, and gunpowder, everything consumed in the act of fighting. It generated no revenue. Every day it was at sea, it cost the crown money. So here is the sharpest way to frame these two ships. One was a floating bank vault with guns bolted on as an afterthought. The other was a gun platform with just enough provisions to reach the next fight. The vault, in the end, was the one worth sinking.
The vault comparison lands harder when you understand what the Galleon's hull was actually built around. Its framing was designed for distributed weight. Hundreds of tons of silver bars and pepper sacks settled evenly across a deep hold, pressing down through the floor timbers in a broad, gentle load. That architecture worked beautifully for cargo. It failed for cannon.
A heavy gun firing on an upper deck doesn't press down, it kicks back, driving a concentrated punch of recoil force into a single timber frame at the point of the mounting. Do that repeatedly, and the seams between the hull planks begin to work open. Shipwrights in Seville knew this. The practical ceiling for a galleon's broadside weight was partly a matter of politics and partly a matter of physics. And the physics didn't negotiate. The man-of-war's internal skeleton evolved around exactly that recoil problem. Heavier riders, closer-spaced frames, and a structural logic that funneled the gun's kick down through the ribs to the keel, rather than laterally into the planking. That is why the two-decker and three-decker warship became a British and Dutch development, not a Spanish one. The Galleon tradition, for all its ambition, had a structural ceiling built into its bones. More guns was never just a question of will.
Eward said no first, and that structural ceiling had a navigation consequence no one expected.
So what did that architecture actually look like below the waterline? The Galleon's deep hold, the same cavity that swallowed silver, silk and spice, doubled as the ship's larder and water magazine. Salt provisions, dried fish, casks enough for months, all of it stowed in the same dark belly as the trade goods, each crossing to Manila a live demonstration that cargo space and survival space were, in this hull, the same space. The man-of-war could not come close. A full crew of 300 to 400 men burned through provisions at a rate the hold simply couldn't support. Weeks, not months. Which is exactly why British naval power in the 18th century required a global chain of victualling bases, Gibraltar anchoring the Mediterranean approach, Antigua covering the Caribbean station, Halifax feeding the North Atlantic patrols. Remove any one of those links, and the fleet starved before it fought. The Galleon
survived the ocean. Size. The man-of-war needed the Empire to survive it first. That navigation gap, weeks versus months at sea, shaped what each ship could absorb in a fight too, because a vessel that must reach port quickly cannot afford to take damage slowly.
Both hulls were built from seasoned oak, and oak at its thickest, the main strakes of a first rate ran close to 2 feet through, could stop a cannonball fired from outside 400 yards. The ball lodged, rather than penetrated, leaving a wound the carpenter could plug. Dangerous, manageable. What was not manageable was the splinter. A single 12-pound shot striking a gun deck beam at close range could detach oak shards a foot long and 3 inches wide, moving at roughly the velocity of the ball itself. Surgeons' logs from the period describe wounds that looked more like axe strikes than punctures. The real casualty count in any broadside exchange was splinter-driven, not ball-driven. Here, the man-of-war's covered gun decks offered something the Galleon's open weather deck could not: a ceiling. Crews reloading between salvos worked under timber overhead, which caught the secondary debris from near misses. Over a 2-hour engagement, that partial shit
Elter compounded. Somber. The Galleon's exposed upper deck, by contrast, lost men to every near miss that skipped across the planking. The Galleon's higher freeboard protected its lower ports. Its upper deck paid for that height in blood.
Treasure hauler or pure warship? Which design philosophy was right? Let's argue in the comments. 11 dimensions in, and the score is closer than most people expect. But the two that remain are where this comparison turns. Because the broadside, the man-of-war's single greatest advantage, has a number buried inside it that changes everything. stay with this. What the broadside actually did. At the ranges these ships typically fought, somewhere between 100 and 200 yards, close enough to see faces but too far for accurate aim, was not punch holes below the waterline. It tore rigging. It killed men on open decks. It dismasted. Action reports from the Anglo-Dutch Wars, examined by naval historians, show a consistent pattern. Ships struck their colors from crew exhaustion, from a fallen mast pinning the helm, or from fires spreading through dry cordage, not from being holed and flooded by
a single salvo. Thoughtful. Which means the broadside was, at its core, an attrition weapon, a psychological one. Pound the enemy long enough and his crew breaks before his hull does.
The Galleon, which never built its tactics around the broadside exchange to begin with, was not as outclassed in pure hull survival terms as the mythology insists. Oak is oak. A well-built galleon hull could absorb a great deal. And the English knew it. They had read the galleon's limitations before the first shot was fired, not from intelligence reports, but from geometry. A ship riding low with cargo cannot heel to run out lower deck guns without shipping water. A crew stretched across trade, navigation, and defense cannot sustain a gun deck through a long afternoon. So Drake and his captains did the one thing the galleon's designers had never modeled. They waited. The mythology gave the broadside a cleaner kill than it ever actually earned. So what did each ship actually leave behind? The galleon's legacy is measured in silver. The mines at Potosí, sitting more than 13,000 feet up in the Andes, produced roughly half the world's silver output across the 16th and 17th centuries. Galleons carried that metal from Callao and Portobello across 2 oceans, west to Manila, east to Seville, and in doing so stitched together the first genuinely global monetary system. Chinese merchants accepted Spanish reales because the coins were reliable. Ottoman traders priced goods against them. One ship type, moving one commodity, connected 3 continents before the concept of a world economy had a name. The man of war left something harder to hold, but wider in reach. The ships of the line that descended directly from its gun deck logic enforced British naval supremacy for the better part of 2 centuries, and that supremacy drew borders, planted languages, and embedded legal frameworks across territories the galleon's captains never
charted. One ship built wealth. Thoughtful. The other built the architecture of control that decided who kept it. And the tension between those 2 ambitions, commerce and coercion, the counting house and the cannon, did not resolve when the last man of war was decommissioned. Size. It just changed uniforms.
So here is what the loops actually close to. In 1588, at least 24 Armada ships were wrecked on the Irish coast by Atlantic storms, against roughly 5 lost to English guns in direct combat. The high stern castles that made a galleon so formidable in a boarding fight turned it into a sail-covered weather vane the moment a gale came broadside. The English fleet did not defeat the Armada. The Atlantic did. The English fleet just made sure the Armada couldn't turn around. That myth, though, had its own strategic logic, because a dismasted ship, its helm pinned and its crew bled down to exhaustion, was a ship that could be taken whole. Prize crews, salvaged cannon, captured stores. The broadside was never meant to destroy. It was meant to deliver. So the verdict. In a straight fight on open water, the man of war wins. Every time. It was built for exactly that, and nothing else was. But the Manila galleon route ran for 250 years after 1588. 2.5 centuries of silver, silk, and spice crossing the Pacific, long after every man of war that ever fired on a galleon had rotted at its moorings. The ship history called the Loser was not a failed warship. It was a successful civilization, and the ocean it crossed was never just a battlefield. So here is the final count. At least 24 Armada ships swallowed by storms, roughly 5 by English cannon, and the broadside that supposedly ended the Galleon's era was more terror than executioner. Now I want to know, which ship would you rather have commanded? The floating bank vault or the floating gun platform? Tell me below. And if you want to go this deep on the ships that came next, the first-rate ship of the line, 100 guns and 800 men, subscribe, because that one is already in production. I'll see you there.